So welcome to week 12, and we're going to talk about labor relations this week. I'm wondering how many of you have or are unionized, have been or are unionized? So we've got, oh, we got quite a few. Okay. So anybody want to share your thoughts? I've been on both sides of the table. So I have my thoughts, but does anybody want to share their thoughts about unions and their values? Nobody wants to be recorded saying this. I'll start off. Oh, Ryland does. Ryland's being brave. Go for it.
I'm really upsides, downsides. I've been in unionized and non-unionized environments, and at the level that I'm at in our current organization, I think there's a lot of supports and a lot of resources and time that goes into developing things that, as far as from an HR standpoint and managing, especially larger teams, are really useful and just make things really clear for employees. Everything is written, everything is established, and everybody knows what those expectations are and can provide that little bit of consistency. That said, having the flexibility to make those changes when your organization shifts or when things come up and happen is really helpful in certain settings where you're able to make those adjustments. So there's upsides and downsides to both. It's what fits for that organization and that space.
Yeah. So continuing on the theme, Erin, what did you want to share?
I only worked in one unionized environment. I was not part of the union. It was the worst, like most toxic workplace I ever worked in. And it scared me away from it, probably for good. There was a lot of like infighting amongst the members of the union.
Yep.
And like the president of the local union worked alongside me. And it was just like, there was a situation where one of our coworkers needed like a special accommodation for illness reasons. And it was just kind of like unbelievable how people reacted to it. And I'm like, but you're all in the same union and you like kind of like fought for these privileges that like it was just kind of like unbelievable. And like friends of mine that came up, like I'm 37, and friends of mine that came up in nursing really struggled as well getting into it and finding out how their union treated new people. And it was just, they're kind of further along in their careers now because you start out at 22 and right into the profession. But yeah, like it was just so hierarchical, within the union itself, that it wasn't particularly welcoming at the time.
Yeah. Doug, you had a comment.
Well, for me, my experience, my first job when I was in high school was working in Ontario in a grocery store. And we were unionized. And I mean, from an employee's point of view, especially somebody that's young and new to the workforce, they seemed great. Because, every year they renegotiate, or whenever they'd renegotiate our contract, there would be raises and back pay and all this excellent stuff. When you're a kid and you're all of a sudden it's like, oh, I got a bonus check here, out of the blue. And it was, I now looking back on it, so many years later, you can see there were all those elements that were discussed previously. Like you could see there was a hierarchy. There was definitely, within the unionized employees, as a student, you were kind of bottom of the barrel, but you didn't realize at the time because, all these other, perks, all you're looking at was the paycheck basically at the end of the day. But like I said, through eyes of maturity, I guess, when you look back, you can see all those elements, but there are definitely, good and bad to the situations.
Yeah. John posted on the discussion board a similar story where as a kid, he worked in a grocery store, and it looked like it was really great. Great deal getting, surprise checks and all the rest of it. But he discovered one of the initiatives that the local put through was around preferred scheduling. And so the full timers ended up that they didn't have to work on weekends, and it was only part-timers that were working on weekends. And so he said, you know, there were some real downsides to it. And my response to that was, you know, the unions originally had the goal of creating full-time jobs that would pay a living wage. And so part-time people didn't fit into this scenario. And that kind of fits along with the stream of some of the comments that came from Aaron and Ryland as well, that when you're outside of the box in terms of your needs and stuff, the union is not quick to respond appropriately, and management too. And part of it has to do with the collective agreement, and which I call the rule book. But Dawn, you had a comment you wanted to make.
Yeah, I've never worked in a unionized environment as an employee, but in my current position, we actually have 3 unions. And so I've worked in payroll where I've dealt with the retro payments, and we're negotiating 2 right now. So I'm recording secretary. So that's kind of interesting to be in the negotiations and see the ping pong back and forth.
So tell us, when you're sitting there and you're listening, what are some of the things going through your head?
Oh, slow down. They talk so fast. It's interesting. One of the agreements we were doing, I'm more familiar with. So I found that one really, really interesting because I had worked in a position where I had to apply some of it. So it was kind of interesting to hear the back and forth on that and their perspective on it.
Yeah.
This one I'm doing now, I don't know it as well, but I'm getting to know it really quick.
Because again, Sandy on the discussion board was saying that she's going to be participating in the union negotiations that are coming up. And this is her first time at the table. And that had me thinking way, way back, because when I first started working, I worked in corporate for 2 years, and then I was sent to a plant. It was a paint manufacturing plant. And my first day on the job, we were down, we were negotiating the collective agreement. So my boss said to me, okay, you're coming into this meeting, you're not going to say a word. You're not going to make any faces. You're not going to do this. You are going to take notes, and that's all you're going to do. And don't say anything. Don't make any facial expressions. Don't ask any questions. Just take notes. When we go into caucus, and caucus is when the 2 sides go into separate rooms and sort of discuss their strategy on how to move forward, we'll be asking you, you know, who said what and blah, blah, blah. And that's your job. And that's all you're going to do. And that's the only time you're going to talk. And so that was my introduction to negotiating. And I just remember sitting there. Of course, I didn't know anybody except for the guy that had hired me. I didn't know anybody who was there. And I just couldn't understand the process. Because it was this very positional bargaining process that they went through, constantly trying to signal ideas or positions and stuff, but not coming straight out and saying, and you know, this is this and this is that. And I was going, like, it just seemed like the weirdest experience ever. Since then, I guess I was on 11 or more different contract negotiations. And so each time I got busier and more involved in the strategy and negotiation. I would spend about 6 months prior to the negotiations just prepping. So my base, yeah, I saw your eyes go on that one. But yeah, for about 6 months, I would go through grievances and arbitrations that had happened during the term of the last agreement to try and see if there were any trends and anticipate demands that they might have and do research to find out where other organizations have gone on those issues. Lots of research into legislation, making sure that we had all of the legislative changes covered and that we were prepared for any, like if there was any noise, that we're going to be making changes to the Employment Standards Act or anything like that, prepping that material. Like there was just a lot of prep work involved. And then before we went to the table, we had a corporate HR group and we had the industrial relations group there. And so before we could go to the table, we would always have to sit with the corporate group and they would drill us on our responses to different questions and how are you going to present this? And then we would do our no, you got to tweak this, got to tweak that. So by the time we ended, to me, it felt more like a play. You did your research, you wrote your scripts, you did your run-throughs, you tweaked it. And then when you were actually at the table, that's when you were just delivering a predefined script. Maybe it's like being a politician these days with your talking points, right? So it was quite an interesting piece. But then the other interesting piece always was when you got back, you had your agreement and you got back to work and making sure that people were administering the collective agreement according to the language. So those are some of the fun things about labor relations. So let me, I did my, share screen, sorry. So I did my usual slides. So I'm going to share those with you and just talk a little bit about labor relations. Oh, but before I do, I also wanted to open up the floor for any questions about the final reflection in case anybody had some questions. We'll talk a little bit about the four main processes that were presented in this week's material, and then we're wrapping up the course. So the final reflection, and I've seen a lot of people have already, I think half have already handed them in, which is very exciting. But I just wanted to put it out there to see if anybody had any questions. It's a reflective piece. So it's just, hey, if there was one thing that you could implement that you learned in this course and you could implement it at your place of work, what would it be? And just sort of tell me why and why it's important to you and what you've learned. But, and you don't have to do a written piece. If you want to go be a little out there, you could do a video, you could do a podcast, you could do an infographic. So you don't have to just do a written reflection. It's totally up to you. Or you might do a written reflection, but you might set it up differently than an academic paper. So it could be more like a diary. What's the word I'm looking for? Like an insert in your diary or whatever.
An entry.
Journal entry?
Sorry?
A journal entry?
Yes, thank you, Erin. I had a brain stoppage there. So is there anything that you want to ask me about the final paper before you get going on it, other than it's due tomorrow night? Everyone's okay? You guys might have already passed yours in. I don't know. Doug, is yours in? Yeah, okay. So no questions. All right. Well, I hope you have fun with it. All right. So we got Drake with us today, and he's like either on the no union or the yeah, let's go union side. And we had sort of a chat about it. I talked to a peer a couple of years ago because I was struggling with the question of, do unions have any relevance today? Because if you look back historically, they came about in order to create safe workplaces where you got a reasonable salary and some benefits. And that's what they were about. And they were instrumental in terms of bringing in legislation. Like, for example, paid maternity leave was something that came about as a result of the negotiations with Canada Post. And so they were able to get maternity leave and some payments in there. And then you started to see it picked up by the government in terms of mat leave. So they have been instrumental. And it's really, really interesting when you go on the websites of different unions and you have a look, there's almost like two different approaches. Unifor tends to be more of an economically focused group. So they're about getting the best pay, the best benefits for their workers that they can. They will get involved in some social issues, but they are much more focused on the money side of things. And then you have a union like CUPE, and CUPE has this huge social change platform. And so when you go on their site and you start looking at some of the activities that they've been involved in, they are trying to not only make social change within Canada, but they're also trying to affect change around the world. So unions can be quite different. But the operating, like when you start a business, you're non-unionized. And something has to happen. We have to go through a certification process before a union comes into effect, before it has a legal standing. And so that's where I come up with this statement that if your company's been unionized, you earned the right. You messed around with people enough with your, maybe you didn't pay people consistent and fairly. Maybe you didn't treat people fairly. Maybe there was bullying and stuff going on. Maybe you were withholding vacation pay. Like the stuff some companies, like it's really interesting in Ontario, you can go on the employment standards site and you can read some of the dopey things that some companies tried to get away with that were against the Employment Standards Act. And I'm going like, why would they even bother trying? It's pretty standard, you got to pay vacation. So why are you trying to avoid it? But decisions are made. And this is why people end up saying, okay, I'm for a union, and we go through a process called certification. So certification is the whole process of first of all, identifying what jobs would be unionized, and then letting the people who are in those jobs vote about whether or not they want to be part of a union. And it sounds very simple, but it can get very contentious. There's lots of unfair labor acts, and depending upon the legislation and what the repercussions for some of these unfair labor acts, organizations can decide to really push the envelope in terms of the ways that they try and encourage people not to vote against the union. And it was in Ontario, there was a period where the repercussions, they were like a little slap on the wrist, and that was it. And companies went crazy. I mean, the risk was very small of getting any kind of penalty. And so fine, we're going to go full out and do everything we can to try to make sure that the union doesn't get in. When the legislation changed and the penalties became much stiffer, and all of a sudden behaviors within the organization started to change. So it's quite interesting. So the default position is non-unionized. And if you become unionized, take some time to reflect about what were some of the things that as management you were making decisions about that got people upset enough to organize. Has anyone here ever been involved in a certification drive? No? Me neither. I've had students. I had one student and he worked at IKEA and he was out on his coffee break and somebody started yakking to him about a union, and he had no idea who the person was, but when he came back in, he got grilled by his supervisors about who was this and what were they asking him and blah, blah, blah. So, and I had another student, it was pretty funny. She was working, I was telling the story, I think it was a Sears warehouse, and they had locked out, oh, it wasn't an organizing drive, but it was a strike. They had locked out the workers, and so they'd hired a whole bunch of people to cross the picket lines, and the company did have the right to do it. It was legal to do, and she couldn't understand. She didn't really understand why there were all these people in tents when around the property. And she didn't understand why they were so angry with her, but for a whole summer she worked there. And I asked her, did anybody ever call you a scab? And she said, yeah, they used to call me that all the time. And I'm going, because you were crossing their picket line. And she's going like, totally unaware of what was going on. But with the organizing, legislation is really important in this. There are a lot of rules, and they vary by province about what you have to do, what percentage of the workers have to agree that they want to be unionized, when you take a vote, who's counting, all of this stuff. But and there's certainly, did anybody read the article that was talking about the Amazon? Yeah. Was there anything in there that surprised you, Doug?
I think the biggest thing was just that, the little guy got through and the big unions got crushed. I think that was the biggest takeaway. Like, you would think the bigger the union, the more power they would have to be able to go in and make change, but that was completely opposite.
Yeah. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens. But it was grassroots. It was somebody that you knew who was saying, hey, these are the things that we're experiencing and we shouldn't be experiencing them. And if we come together, we'll have the power to stop these things from happening. The problem is getting the first contract, because once you're certified and now you can start collecting union dues, as a union, your next job is to get the first contract. And management doesn't have any, it's not on their agenda to get a quick contract. The longer that they can continue the negotiations and frustrate the workers, because the workers are sitting there going, why did we bother? And one of the biggest challenges have been places like Tim Hortons and Starbucks, because you have to certify each store separately. And so I can have a union drive, I can get the union certified, then we're not getting a collective agreement. Management locks us out. They start hiring other part-timers to come in. I'm standing on a picket line, watching all of these cars come in and get their double-double. And there's all these people who are working and making the money that I would have made. and I'm not getting a contract. And so all of the things the union said they were going to improve, things are worse. And they don't see any sign of getting better. And so if I kind of lose faith, then I can go to another Tim Hortons and get a job there and forget about the union that they were trying to organize at my branch. So it can be very tough, and you can see Walmart has been extremely successful at fighting unions globally. There's been a lot of attempts in Canada to unionize, and to the best of my knowledge, they still, even though they won the union has won certifications, they haven't been able to get a first contract, and then they've decertified. So just getting the right to represent is only the first step. Then getting that first contract is a critical second step. And that's all around negotiating the collective agreement. And has anybody here ever seen a collective agreement? No? Ryland, you have. Did you want to talk about what your impression of it was?
That was kind of what I was talking about in my first point, where that's, to me, those collective agreements, once they're negotiated and agreed on, especially for larger organizations that manage a lot of employees, they're super helpful because they are generally really clear. Everybody across every department has a section, knows what's going on, knows what it breaks everything down and answers every question when done correctly that you could ever come up across, and just has a black and white answer for you, so that everybody is treated the same. Everybody has those same expectations. They're not secret. They're generally very available for all of your employees. And I've had eyes on a couple of them, and don't get me wrong, every now and again they can get a little bit gray in the legal jargon, and they'll try and kind of create some gray areas, but for the most part, they're really comprehensive documents.
Okay. Dawn, what are your thoughts on them?
We have 3. So we're constantly going back to the book. Each of us here has our copy of the agreement, and there's highlighted spots and notes written in and little tabs on them. And then when the new one comes in, you got to transfer all your data, your little notes to the new one. So yeah, it is helpful, because whenever there's a question, you just say, okay, let's go look. And where we have 3, sometimes you have to really look, because you think you know what it is, but you're thinking of something, the other one.
Yeah, so that's important. Within the organization, you might have multiple unions, and so you'll have multiple collective agreements. I have a friend who works at the University of Toronto, and there are 17 different locals and 17 different collective agreements. And so you got to be really careful that you are referencing the correct document and the correct article and clause when you're giving anybody advice about what to do. Sometimes the language in the collective agreement can be challenging, and we'll see an example of that in a minute. But they do tend to be a little legalistic, which makes it difficult. Although every member of the bargaining unit is supposed to have access to the collective agreement, a lot more of them are online now. They used to always, we used to print them and hand them out. But everybody should have access to the collective agreement, and it is really the guide. So if you think something was supposed to happen a certain way, you go and you look it up in the collective agreement. There are union stewards that are there to help union members interpret the language, and if they believe that the language has not been followed, there is a process called the grievance arbitration process that they can follow to try and get it rectified. So, and once you've rectified it, then everyone after that is going to be treated in that manner. So it does provide for clarity, but it doesn't always cover everything. And I think, for example, the pandemic would have introduced so many questions around what are we supposed to do, and versus what does a collective agreement say? Because the collective agreement never anticipated something like the pandemic. And so when organizations were looking at remote work or what kind of health and safety protocols need to be in place, there wasn't anything in the collective agreement or that was directly addressing that kind of stuff. And in the like one of the big changes in labor relations is that in the negotiations, there was traditionally very much a positional bargaining process. So I, as either the member of management or union, would present the position. This is my answer to the problem, and these are all the reasons why this answer is the right one, and you should agree with me. And you would go back and forth until you found some agreement. What we're starting to see evolve more is a greater understanding that both parties are all working towards the organization being successful. So if we collaborate a little more, rather than trying to knock heads in negotiations, but if we collaborate a bit more, we'll be able to come up with better solutions to some of the really challenging problems that are facing organizations and unions these days. So you're starting to see parts of the collective agreement that are being negotiated much differently than what they had been in the past. But certainly that first experience of sitting at the table and watching what was, it was a head scratcher. I could not, for the life of me, figure out how you had 12 people sitting in a room all yelling at each other. And we had one guy on the union side, Peter, and he was the nicest guy 99% of the time. But every time we had a negotiating meeting or a union management meeting, Peter would be quiet and he'd be going along with, and then all of a sudden Peter would blow up and he'd be yelling and screaming and pounding on the table and carrying on. And then once he had finished, it was like, okay, Peter's done his thing. And we would just continue from exactly where we had stopped before he blew up. And the first time I saw that, I was like, what's happening here? And as I started to understand the individuals and the roles they were playing in this play that we were putting on, I started to understand, you know, what Peter was up to and how we were managing him. So it was kind of different. In the piece, I also put some stuff about language. And I always loved this particular piece of language. It went to arbitration. There was an employee and she was granted educational leave of absence, and she applied for this allowance in lieu of salary. And management came back and said to her, this year we are not granting this allowance to anybody. So it's not you, no one's getting it. And so she felt that this was not following the collective agreement, and they went through the grievance arbitration process. Now so the grievance process happens in-house, and that's where you raise the issue with your boss, and then we put it in writing, and then it goes to different committees, And then finally, somebody in management gives the final statement about the company's position. And if the union isn't happy with that position, they have the right to take it to an outside third party, an arbitrator, who makes a decision that's final and binding about what the language really says. So have a look at this language and tell me, if you were reading it, do you think the company had the right to turn down this request for the allowance in lieu of salary on the basis that they weren't giving it to anybody that particular year? Doug, you want to take a try?
Well, I think the big thing for me reads right at the beginning, at the employee's discretion, or employer's, sorry, discretion. So that to me says that they can make that decision and say no. So
Okay, so you're looking, no, I can't. Can I annotate here? I can annotate. So you're looking at this piece here.
well, that and then it's followed up by similar language like may receive. So it doesn't say it's concrete.
Yep.
Well, doesn't that maybe indicate that you're entitled to the leave, but you may or may not get the allowance? It doesn't say anything about who grants the leave.
So if I were picking this apart, the first thing is the person has to be an employee of this organization and covered by this collective agreement. Second thing, they have to have already been granted leave of an educational leave without pay before they can try and receive the allowance in lieu of salary, right?
Right.
Any other thoughts? Anything else in there you think is suggesting that the company is right or wrong about denying everybody this allowance?
It doesn't say they can't.
Who's they?
It doesn't say that the employer can't deny everybody for the whole year.
Okay.
And
I'm going to go back to Doug's statement, and could people Google what discretion means?
the freedom to decide.
Is that the entire definition?
What should be done in a particular situation.
Thank you. What's the important piece in there?
What should be done.
It's
It's
Sorry.
what should be done, not what they want to be done.
No, it's the second half.
yeah, particular situation, which implies that it's a case-by-case application.
Exactly. And that's what the arbitrator came back and said, that the company had to look at each application on its own, that they could not do a broad statement if nobody's getting this. And if you think about it, making the statement that no employee is going to get it is like crossing out that clause in the collective agreement and saying, not this year, we don't have enough money, right? And so the piece that got them tied up was at the employer's discretion. And so the arbitrator said that they did have to consider the individual requests. Doug?
Oh, well, I was just going to say, in that case, it was the language that they presented, because in theory, there's nothing that would stop them from implementing that and just say, okay, we thought about it. No. And the next person, yeah, we thought about it. No.
Exactly. And what they could have done was, like, if you read the language really carefully, they can grant an allowance of up to 100%. Okay, so they could grant 0%. Or if the employee had been given some grants, they could have granted the equivalent of that and said, but you know, so we're going to grant you $500. Oh, but you got a $500 bursary, so you get 0. There were 100 different ways the company could have met their goal of not paying this allowance during that year. And they could have done it and all would have been legitimate, because words like may are very important. If it said should or must, completely different language. And so where they fell down was that they made the error of not looking at each of the cases separately. And so, you know, Ryland is saying, you know, the language is great and it covers all kinds of stuff, but the language can also become a real challenge if it's getting misinterpreted, or the other thing that can happen is you write language at the table. This is always a big thing for us. The union would give us language, and the first thing we would do is crumple it up and throw it into the paper basket, into the waste basket, because our concern as management was we were giving up rights. We weren't going to let the union put the language in case there was something in the wording that we didn't see. And so we would go back with our own wording, and we were very deliberate that the wording, we would have control over it. And if we were going to make a mistake, then it was our fault. But, you know, putting stuff in there at the employer's discretion, it requires something. If that wasn't there, then they could say, you know, this year we're budget-wise, we can't afford it, so we're not going to be doing this allowance. But it was just a really interesting example of how that language can become problematic, and we have to be really careful about it. So writing good language for collective agreements is an art in itself. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions about, has anybody else been involved in a grievance or understanding language? My favorite one, when I was working at the college, I had been working in a group that was more project-based, and I was going back to faculty. And so I was told that I was going to be working through the summer. And so I was going to be working from May to the end of August, and then into the fall, I would be teaching in the fall semester. And I was lucky because I knew the collective agreement, and I went, well, that's great. I said, I have no problem with that. But if you review the collective agreement, I can only teach so many weeks consecutively without a vacation. So this is going to put me into an atypical vacation period. And I said, I'll take my 2 months in January and February because I'll go skiing. And then I'll heck let loose as they reviewed the collective agreement, and they went, oh, she read it correctly. And all of a sudden they were changing my vacation times again because they did not want me on an atypical rotation for vacations. So they do take away some of the flexibility that management would like. Marcia, you have a comment.
Yeah, we, well, there's a number of things that are kind of going on in the organization, but was just recently involved in a grievance, what was brought about in the beginning of, well, I guess it was January, February, when we had a lot of snow. So the collective agreement has the hours of work. And so like 7 to 3:30 for the majority of our public works crew. And there is an LOU that states that the employer can vary the hours of operation given 2 weeks notice. Now, through the pandemic, something that what the employer had done was pay a shift differential to our public works employees. So they worked 7, but were paid for 8, something like that. And so when when we decided to go ahead and say, okay, we're going to vary the hours, a number of employees brought a grievance forward that, first of all, they wanted to be paid the shift differential, but also they brought the grievance forward that the employer was not allowed to do that, even given the 2 weeks notice. But what was interesting about it is there were 7 or 8 employees. And so they, went through the step 1, and then when they went to the step 2 and our CAO met with each of them individually, a number of them were like, oh, we didn't talk to the certain union rep to find out what we're supposed to say. So it was just an interesting situation because they clearly, a lot of them didn't know why they were there, but it was just, so it was different.
Yeah, so when you're going through the grievance procedure, there is a position called a union steward, and the union steward is part of the executive on the local, and they're supposed to be helping the regular union members represent themselves during the grievance procedure. And then there's a point where often after the first stage, which is the verbal discussion, once the grievance goes into writing, the grievance no longer belongs to the individual, it belongs to the union. And so they take over the presentation of arguments and stuff. So it's kind of interesting to think that, the local was allowing the members or putting the members in the position where they were supposed to be defending their grievance, and they weren't getting support from the local.
Yes.
Yeah. And the whole thing is, it's when you get into that grievance arbitration process, it's a very legal, it's a semi-legal process where it's intended, it was developed so that you didn't take these things through the court system, but they have to be very carefully orchestrated, because everything that is said and everything that's submitted as evidence may at some point end up in front of an arbitrator, a third party, who's going to make a decision that's final and binding. And so as management, I want to have control over my messaging, over the data that I'm presenting, and the union needs to do the same thing in order to forward their belief on what the language is intending. And the other thing in your story that I was thinking about is the idea of past practice. In a unionized environment, what you've done in the past holds a lot of weight in terms of how you're interpreting the language. And so, you were sort of faced with a situation and the pandemic, you paid a premium and everybody was okay with it. But then if you tried to go back to the language and maybe get rid of the premium, the union's yelling, no, we have past practice here. This is how it's been interpreted, and we want that interpretation to continue.
Yes.
Yeah. Dawn, I noticed you nodding your head a couple of times there.
Yeah, it's all the same. We have some articles, you read them and they're clear as a bell and you know exactly what you need to do. And then there's one article, there's one of our agreements, I had to calculate the seniority for it. And every year I would read it and I'd be like, this makes no sense to me. Somebody needs to explain it to me again, because I'm still not satisfied with what I'm getting.
Yeah.
It makes no sense. But like I say, then other things are really clear and you know exactly what you're going to do.
Yeah.
But past practice, definitely, we've had that come up quite a bit.
Yeah, and that's where, making sure you get your first line supervisors online with the, and everybody doing the same thing. Not one cowboy or cowwoman off doing their own sort of thing and making deals and all the rest of it, because it's the deals that one person is creating that becomes the focus of the past practice discussion. And it's hard as management to argue, well, the person was doing it without authorization. Well, it went on for X number of years. Did you discipline the person? No. So maybe it's fine then. Maybe their interpretation was correct. So sometimes, and that's part of the reason why you need to renegotiate the collective agreement, because it gives you that opportunity to go back to the language and to identify the stuff that's giving you problems and adjust it so that it won't continue to give you problems. So that first contract, that you're going to have problems. It's like writing a play. You need to wordsmith and change things in order to make it clear and repeatable for everyone. Any other thoughts or questions about unions anybody would like to raise? No? Okay, well, I gotta stop annotating. So I'm moving to the thank you. I've enjoyed being with you guys. This was the first run through the course, and you guys have given me some good food for thought on things that worked and things that maybe didn't work as well. And I'm always I used to hate marking assignments, but I have to say that between this experience and the one I had in organizational behavior, I'm almost starting to look forward to marking them, because you guys are doing this wonderful job of taking everything you've learned and integrating it into your thinking and your approach. And that's so satisfying, because that's what HR is all about. There's never a compensation problem or a labor relations problem or a performance management problem. There are messy problems, and they're made up of all of the different things. And so it was just really rewarding to see you guys doing that kind of thinking, because that means that you'll be able to do that kind of thinking in the workplace. So thank you for making it such an enjoyable experience for me. And I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. And my last thought is, have a happy Canada Day. I guess this is the week of holidays, because there's St. John Baptiste was on Friday, and there's something else in Newfoundland today, and then Canada Day this week. So lots going on. So officially, you're done. Congratulations. And I'll hang around and talk to people, but otherwise I think we have successfully completed our introductory course to human resources.
Thank you, everybody. I have to get back to work. Nice to meet everyone.
Take care of
Thank you for
everybody out there, Kim.
Thank
Nice
you
meeting
for
you.
everything. Thank you for everything, Linda.
You're welcome.
Take care.